We're reading Nubs, the true story of a mutt, a marine, and a miracle. Outside a border fort in the desert of western Iraq, a small, thin dog watched and waited. His ears had been cut off to make him a dog of war. He had no name and no person to call his own. Despite his size, he was the leader of his pack, a group of wild dogs that survived by eating desert mice and rats and scraps from the Iraqi soldiers stationed at the fort. As the dog scanned the desert for a possible meal, the stillness of the fall morning was broken by the roar of engines. Rumbling closer and closer, he hunkered down in the sand. 3 military Humvees, carrying Major Brian Dennis and his 10 Marines, lumbered to a stop. They were part of the Border Transition Team 352, there to help train the Iraqi soldiers. But the dog without ears cautiously approached Brian, who knelt down on one knee to pet him.
That night, Nubs and Brian ate dinner together. They shared Brian's MRE, or meals ready to eat, of spaghetti and Cajun beans and rice. For dessert, Nubs sampled a strawberry Pop-Tart, wagging his tail. Later that evening, Nubs stayed with Brian when it was his turn at guard duty. Together, they kept everyone safe. The next day, Brian gave Nubs an extra long belly rub. Then he stepped into his Humvee and drove away. The whole pack chased after the vehicles but quickly lost interest and turned back, not Nubs. Running faster and faster, he tried to catch up with Brian. He ran for more than a mile. He had no way of knowing that it was against the rules for Marines to have pets. Left behind, Nubs stared after the Humvees as they disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert. Long, lonely weeks passed without any sight of that trio of Humvees and Marines called Scout, Boss, and Chuck.
Near the end of December, when the temperature dipped to a bone-chilling 30 degrees, the Humvees again rumbled up to the border fort. The pack dogs ran to greet Brian, but not Nubs. He hung back, gaunt and weak from a deep wound in his side. Shivering from pain, Nubs allowed Brian and the team medic to clean the wound and applied antiseptic ointment from the men's first aid kits. He even swallowed the child-sized dose of antibiotic Brian gave him, but Nubs refused to eat or drink. It hurt so much, he tried to sleep standing up. When Brian got up at 4 a.m. to turn at watch, Nubs stiffly padded into place beside him, head and tail drooping. He faithfully made the rounds with Brian. Then, Brian climbed into Boss and the 3 Humvees pulled away. Determined not to be left behind again, Nubs chased after Brian. He couldn't keep up. Alone, he returned to the fort. 2 long weeks later, Scout, Boss, and Chuck thundered up to Nubs' fort again. This time, Nub was there to greet them, tail wagging, but still slowly moving. Each night after the sun set over the desert, Nubs and Brian did their job together. Under an ice-black sky of 1,000 stars, they kept watch over everyone.
All too soon, it was time for Brian to leave again. Nubs followed close on his heels. Brian tightened his winter scarf at Kievia around his neck and then climbed inside the Humvee. He leaned out and said to Nubs, "You take care of yourself, buddy." The vehicles rolled across the desert slowly at first, then picking up speed, heading for the command outpost far away on the Jordanian border. Nubs cried as he chased them across the cold, coarse sand. Because of his wound, he could not keep up. He dropped to the ground, exhausted and completely alone. When Nubs sat up, Scout, Boss, and Chuck were out of sight. He struggled to his feet and began walking. Nubs trekked mile after treacherous mile across the desert, shivering through frozen days and nights. There was little to eat and even less to drink. With barely a moment's rest, Nubs pushed on, fighting his way through territories fiercely protected by wolves and wild dogs. 2 snowy days and 70 miles later, Nubs limped into the Iraqi battalion headquarters where Brian was working. A team member ran inside, shouting to Brian, "You're not going to believe who's here." When Nubs saw Brian, he ran with his tongue out and tail wagging right into his arms. "What are you doing here?" Brian said as he held Nubs close and rubbed him all over. Nubs finally felt warm again. He pressed his wet nose against Brian's cheek. Nubs watched Brian climb into Boss, ordering his team back to the command outpost just half a mile away. "I know we're not supposed to have dogs at the outpost," Brian said to his men, "but if he follows us, what can we do?"
When the Humvees began to roll, Nubs trotted right behind them until they reached the command outpost. Nubs liked living at the command outpost with Brian's men and all the other soldiers. He proudly wore a collar that the Marines had fashioned from woven bracelets, sent to them from school children back home. He cheered up his new friends, collecting belly rubs and making them laugh. And even though he had his own doghouse, most nights, Nubs curled up with the barracks with Brian and his team. Nubs sat close by as Brian emailed his family and friends back home, and he supervised the men as they put up flyers to raise money needed for his journey. Nubs was the first to hear good news. Family and friends wanted to help. Nubs posed for his passport photo. He took 3 baths in 3 days to get ready for his trip. That was tiring.
On the last day, Brian packed Nubs' brown blanket and his favorite superhero toy. Brian made a leash for him out of rope. Nubs didn't play with anyone as he usually did. Instead, he sat quietly in a corner. Nubs rested in Brian's arms as he was carried to a Land Rover. He felt Brian's breath tickle his ear. "Be good, buddy. Don't cause any trouble. These guys will take good care of you. I'll see you in a couple of months, I promise." Nubs sat at the border checkpoint for hours as officials pored over his paperwork, making sure everything was in order. Finally, Nubs arrived in Amman, Jordan. The king of Jordan's veterinarian gave him his first checkup and shots. He stayed at the vet's kennel while his travel was being arranged. 2 weeks later, Nubs flew the 10-hour flight from Amman to Chicago. Friends of Brian's picked him up at the airport. Nubs ate steak and strawberry Pop-Tarts for dinner. A few days later, Nubs flew out of Chicago on the last leg of his journey.
When Nubs stepped off the plane in San Diego, he was greeted with banners and all kinds of cameras. He patiently posed for the paparazzi, but was so glad to leave the airport crowd with Brian's friends, Eric and Chrissy. Nubs slept in the comfy new bed, tried all kinds of tasty food, and went for walks in the dog park, but someone was missing. On March 23, 2008, Eric and Chrissy drove Nubs to Camp Pendleton. The paparazzi were there again. Nubs waited and waited when he finally saw Brian. Nubs leaped into his arms and covered him with kisses.
Today, Nubs and Brian lead a busy life. They play at the dog beach and cruise around in Brian's truck. Sometimes they go running or hike in Mission Trails Regional Park. Nubs romps with his friends Boogie and Cabot. Nubs even goes to school. His trainer Graham gives him straight A's. Now Nubs has a name and a person to call his own, and he shares the friendship and love he found with everyone he meets. But Nubs saves his best kisses for his best buddy Brian. The end.